Morning everyone. Hello. So we're going to discuss taxation today. Lots of things have been popping up in the news about what may or may not be in Rachel Reeves's budget. Just to set the scene. So, and the reason why, by the way, there'll be lots of news at the moment about what's going to be in the budget is a couple of reasons. First of all, being August, and now that the nonsense at the start of August is sort of over, it's time to be boring again. And because Parliament's in recess, and you know there's lots of reasons why the news will focus on what you might call some of the minutiae of these things. But the other reason, the big reason, is because there's expected to be not just like a little budget statement, but like a budget at the end of October. Now is the time for lobbying. So this thing doesn't happen in isolation. The Treasury itself will be thinking of things and not quite sure how it's going to work out politically. So there'll be ideas leaked so that the media can talk about them, they can gauge public reaction. Various other people with interest will also want to get stories in the newspapers to try and either build up public support for something or to direct public opposition to something. The Daily Express, for example, is running a campaign against the cuts to winter fuel payments, which of course Labour should be emphasising is actually an increase in winter fuel payments for certain people and a cut, you know, for most. But the bottom line is, what does the budget have to? First of all, the budget is going to be a severe budget because first of all there is the funding hole to fill, and second of all, if you're going to issue a harsh budget, you do it first thing in the Parliament, the start of the parliamentary cycle, because by the end of it, when the election's coming around, that's when, if you haven't already been able to do it, that is when the purse strings have to be loosened. But also Labour have to do it as soon as possible. They can't get away with just doing it just before the next election. Plumduff says, then how bad this budget's going to be, do we think? Well, this is the thing. Because on the one hand, what we know, there are some things we realistically know. We know that taxes there were already going to be taxes going up anyway. I mean, when the Tories keep saying, oh, Labour said they wouldn't put up taxes. Like, no, the manifesto is full of tax increases. They just say they wouldn't put up national insurance, VAT or income tax. Interesting, the Telegraph at the moment, which is the main banner bearer for the Tories these days, is talking about Labour maybe giving themselves room to increase employers' national insurance contributions. I'm not sure they are when I've looked at the quotes, and I'm also not sure that Labour would be well advised to do that, given that I'll have to check the manifesto again just to be absolutely certain, because I was only reading it this morning, but I am pretty sure that Labour ruled out increases to national insurance, not just employee, because there's the employees' contribution to national insurance and the employers. But it's all still national insurance, and I'm pretty sure Labour ruled it out. So I don't think that's what they will be doing. But there is, Carrie saying, will Reeves have an economic impact assessment for Brexit? Should. This is what I keep saying. If we were to actually ask the government with a really loud voice for one thing Brexit related, it would be, when can we expect an economic impact assessment for Brexit? We should have one. The government cannot seriously claim that it's going to do any, like, make Brexit work or whatever. It doesn't matter what the Labour government claim that they're going to do with the economy. Impossible to do it without an economic impact assessment for what is obviously the biggest economic policy that this country has had for, like, since we decided to invade the world, right? But where I want to go with this is there's lots of things. People are inevitably talking about tax rises and where the taxes will rise and spending cuts and where the cuts will hit and all the rest of it to fill in this hole, right? And yet, what no one, and that's people, because people just have this attitude, because most budgets just move numbers around a balance sheet. But there is the possibility of reform, and there was a very interesting article written by a professor of economics, the London School of Economics, and it talks about. So at the moment, Rachel Reeves, when she stands up to deliver that budget at the end of October, will be able to say, the Tories left us in this massive hole. We knew that anyway. And she will also say, but the hole is bigger than any of us realise. And she's got credibility there. The Office for National Statistics and the Institute for Fiscal Studies have backed that up as well. The hole is bigger. We've just had the news this week that the cost of borrowing is higher than was forecast. That's an extra few billion quid in the hole as well. So this hole is getting bigger, effectively. So she can say it is tight. You know, we need to do things drastically, and we need to do some things that we didn't talk about before the election because we didn't know. We knew about the state. We knew that the financial situation was a right state, but they were hiding just how bad it was, and she can claim that. But it also gives you the impetus to talk about reforms. Now, imagine she could, instead of saying, you know, this is a harsh budget, but it's how we get the economy moving, and then after this, we should be in a much better position. Instead of being able to say that, let's say she could stand up and say, we need to deal with this. That means we need reform. And I'm going to do it in a way where most people will actually see their taxes come down. Imagine she does that. And I don't just mean by, oh, yeah, we'll just massively tax the rich again. Because it's like, the tax burden needs shifting upwards. Because, you know, but, and when they say things like, okay, if you, sorry, I'm going to have to have a little drink. When they say things like, oh, you know, if you put these taxes on the rich, they'll just flee the country. They say that all the time. But there is a point at which that will be true. There is a point at which if you apply certain taxes too high, that actually investment will go down. For example, the one thing that's been talked about in the Telegraph today about this, you know, Labour talking about increasing the employer's contribution to national insurance. Now, that actually would be a very dodgy thing to do, not only because Labour said they wouldn't put up national insurance. It does genuinely make employers less likely to want to employ more people, because the cost to an employer of hiring a worker is not just that worker's salary, it's also the employer's national insurance contribution, and if it's in a decent sized business, the employer's pension contribution as well. So the cost of hiring a worker is more than the worker's salary. It can be quite a bit more as well. So if you put up employers' national insurance, there is genuinely an argument that it will make businesses think, well, how can we get more workers out of our existing employees rather than hire more workers? So you stifle the job market. So they have to be careful with that for various reasons. But this professor is talking about, but where you don't get all of these issues, because the thing with any form of sort of like an income tax or a salary tax or anything like that is when you put it too high, you change people's behaviour in a way that negatively impacts the economy. But land tax is different. Property tax is different, he's saying. In fact, I'll read out exactly what it says here. The value of land is largely not a result of the owner's own efforts, but is instead attributable to a favourable location, blah, 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 blah. The problem we have, if we think about land taxes that exist now, council tax is the most famous, it's the one we're all familiar with. It's rubbish, it doesn't work. Because Buckingham Palace pays less in council tax than a nice little semi-detached house in some parts of the country. You've got some parts of the country where you can have a detached house in like a really posh part of London like Kensington, paying less council tax than, again, a semi-detached house in the Midlands. You know, it's the way you think about council tax, it's like, oh, well, the more expensive the property, the more council tax you pay. But it doesn't really work out that way. First of all, it's based on house values in like about 1990-ish or 1989, 1990 or something. It's woefully out of date because some parts of the country, property prices absolutely exploded more than in others. So it now bears no relation. Pikachu saying, I view council tax as poll tax 2.0. Well, it was literally that. It's just that council tax was a bit more equitable. But it still, it doesn't work. what would be, and the argument that's been made, a lot of people will say the problem with updating, because the major problem we're saying with council tax, therefore, is we're not updating it to take account of modern property prices. And people say, but then, you know, you can't value every house in the country. How are you going to do it? You can't just do this. And what they actually say is actually with AI, you can. So with current technology, you could actually come up with, and it's not like anyone will be able to complain. It's like, oh, you're not getting the value of my home quite right. It's like, well, it doesn't matter, does it? Because council tax at the moment bears no relationship or almost no relationship to the value of the home. You know, you can actually pay more council tax than someone who's got a much more expensive property than you. You can be in a house that's worth £150,000, be paying more council tax than someone who's in a house that's worth £600,000. It's mad. It's absolute, and there are examples of that around the country. So this idea is, first of all, you tax. In fact, the actual way this professor's going is actually talking about get rid of income tax, not now, phase it out. Eventually get rid of income tax and just have land or property tax. I wouldn't say that. I think there should always be an income tax, because there will always be some people with high incomes, but they don't own much. So they need taxing as well, right? But the idea of a land tax, like an income tax, if you put that too high, because what we're talking about just before, if you put up income tax or any form of like income tax too high, you can get to a point where people will then leave the country or pull investment. With land, it's different. The land is there. You can't take the land with you. So if someone decides that the tax on that land they own is too much, they can't just take it away to another country. They'll have to sell it to someone who will buy it and pay that tax. So that tax is still going to be levied. It also allows you to do other things as well. Like we have a problem at the moment. So if we look at council tax, so if you own a house, say, but you don't live there, now if you're renting it out to someone, the council tax is being paid. It's being paid by the person who's renting it, but it's being paid, right? As soon as it's vacant, all of a sudden not so much council tax because it's unoccupied. Well, you don't pay as much council tax. Well, that's mad. What you actually should do is say, in a situation where we have a housing shortage, we should actually penalise people leaving properties empty. So they should pay more. Now, someone did mention earlier in the thing that councils from next year have been given permission to charge double council tax for like second homes, which is true. Although, guess what? A couple of weeks ago, the Telegraph wrote an article about how to get out of it. And there will be, given that this is something the Tories put in place, there'll be lots of ways to get out of it, but mark you me. So that's something Reeve should look at. But if the idea is just get rid of council tax, replace it with a land tax, then the person who owns the land has to pay for it. Now, we know if you're renting, okay, you won't pay it directly. Your landlord will just fold it into the rent. So you'll still effectively be paying it. That's fine. But what it means is that that landlord will still be paying it, even if they've got no tenants. And actually, if they, you know, you could have a grace period if like you've no tenant for like a month or something because people have just moved, okay. But if it's unoccupied for a certain length of time, that actually the tax you'll pay on it will increase. So you could actually increase the amount of tax, basically have a sliding scale. You can tax the land according to how beneficial it is to society. So, for example, one of the things, if you even talk about a land tax that will straight away come out in the Daily Telegraph, I will guarantee, is, oh, they're going to clobber farms, because they've already tried it before. And all you have to do is say, no, farms are really useful. We won't apply the tax to farm. Any land used for farming won't have a tax applied to it. So that'll have a tax rate of 0%. So you apply land tax everywhere, but you have different categories. If it's used for certain purposes, 0%. If it's used for some other purposes, a certain amount. So occupied houses would have a relatively low rate, but because it would be a set rate based on the value, then for housing, for example, you could have a situation where you replace council tax with this other tax. It can still raise more money, but most people will find it won't be a council tax bill, it'll be a different bill, a tax bill, but it will go down. So you can, you know, she could actually stand up in theory, and now the professor does point out you'll have to be a little bit careful with it because for some properties it would go up, you don't want to create a housing market crash where suddenly loads of properties are devalued. So you have to be a little bit careful. Start off with a low rate. But all I would say is, as long as the new tax raises a bit more money than council tax as things currently stand, you're filling in the hole, and it gives you the scope over time of ramping it up. It's a little bit like tax on tobacco and alcohol, where particularly on tobacco, when they were really trying to dissuade people from smoking, you just ramped it up a bit at a time, each year a little bit, or every couple of years. But there we go. Anyway, I'll catch up with a few comments. It should make foreigners who own UK houses land pay a premium. If that means they sell, so what? Prices would come down due to increased supply in the market. So, I mean, that's another thing in theory you could do. Again, you'd always have to look at the politics of this. But given that, you know, you could certainly make it. The beauty of something like this is you could have different rates of land tax. Like I said, you could have 0% for like farmland and maybe some other things that are considered like really useful. You could have a lowish rate for occupied housing. You could have a higher rate for unoccupied housing that, you know, for example, if you, let's say you buy land, you know, some people, there's not even houses on it, but they've bought land for development, for a housing development, but they're sitting on the land until they think it's going to be given the best return to sell it to a housing developer. You charge that at a high rate. It's unused. It's land that's supposed to be used for housing, but you're not currently using it for housing. So you might, for example, say if you've got some land and there's a housing development built on it. Now, I don't know. I'm not a builder. Let's say you've got a plot of land that's going to be used to build a housing estate on it. How long does it take to build that housing estate? I would say no more than 2 years. So what I would say is something like this. If you buy land for the purposes of housing development, you can have, while there's actual building going on, you can have a 2-year period where you'll pay 0 land tax because that's beneficial. It's going to result in houses, right? If the housing development goes beyond 2 years, all of a sudden that tax break ends because you've had enough time to build the houses, you're dragging your feet, right? So you'll be suddenly paying the land tax for it. So it dissuades people from sitting on top of it. And of course, as soon as the houses are built, as soon as they're, you know, they're available to be moved in, then again it ends. You know, something like that. So you'd look at something like that, wouldn't you? You could absolutely do that. Electric gaming, there's 1,000% tax on membership of the Tory party. No. We can't be mean. Daniel's saying, should go back to doing videos on what Labour are doing, not what you'd like them to do. Labour not plan any of this. Well, we don't know that they're not planning any of this. We just haven't had any little leaks come out, so I strongly suspect they're not. But in terms of what Labour are doing, I mean, what are they doing at the moment? They are rolling back the anti-union strike laws that the Tories brought in, and the Tory press is going absolutely loopy over it. But a lot of what they're doing is stuff that they sort of did before. Like at the moment, we don't know a lot of what they're doing. We know what they're announcing, but they announced all that before anyway. All they're announcing at the moment is what was in the manifesto. So the only area of which was covered to death in the election, right? If I do a video on what Labour have done in the last few weeks, it gets 0 views because it's what's in the manifesto. Apart from dealing with the riots, that's another thing. Although you'll notice even with the riots, the way Labour are putting it now is like, because of the early releases of prisoners, they're saying, oh, we need to make room for the rioters. And it's like, well, yeah, we do. But they were going to be releasing prisoners early anyway, because we needed room for more prisoners regardless of if the riots hadn't happened, the early releases were still going to be happening. Although there is a bit of misinformation going out about that. I saw someone put something up. Can't remember where it was. Was it on my channel or was it on Twitter or something? Where someone was, I think they'd rung into LBC or something and said, oh, you know, this guy who stabbed his partner is being released early. And it's like, no, because Labour have specifically ruled out releasing anyone who's in for domestic violence, so that won't be quite right. But anyway, they say building permissions artificially inflates land prices. Well, one of the things Labour are talking about, of course, trying to make it easier to get planning permission. Now, things like that I always am a little bit hesitant at, because there are good reasons for having red tape, as we might call it, to make sure that what you're building is going to be suitable. But that should lessen. But nonetheless, again, the idea of applying a land tax means at the moment we have a situation where people who own a great deal of land often don't pay very much in tax. And the fact, as this professor's pointing out, you apply taxes to income or spending, like sales taxes. And if you put it up, like if you increase sales taxes, you probably reduce sales because you just made things more expensive. And this is why, for example, Labour during the banking crisis reduced VAT. VAT was 17.5%. They reduced it to 15%, specifically to stimulate the economy. Because in something like the banking crisis, it's going to create this huge recession. It was a very deep recession. And inevitably people stop spending, not because they haven't got money. It's not just obviously if you lose your job, a lot of people in a recession are going to lose their job. That's what creates a recession, a significant drop in productivity, right? So that means people have probably lost their jobs. So they have less money to spend. So obviously they're going to spend less. But the vast majority of people who have a job, even in a very bad recession, don't lose that job. They still have that job. They still have their income. They still have their spending power. But because people are a little bit more wary, they may feel that their job security has diminished. They tighten their belts in a way that they don't really need to. So what Labour did by reducing VAT was try and encourage people to carry on spending, and it worked. And then, of course, when the Tories came straight in and then it was always going to go back up to 17.5% anyway. That was just a temporary measure. But then they put it up to 20%, where it's had been ever since. And again, it's worth pointing out the Tories are the only party that has ever increased VAT. Labour have never increased VAT. They've reduced it a couple of times. One time permanently, but that was on energy. The Tories just they just put it up. And the same thing will apply. If you increase sales tax, you reduce sales. So that can hurt the economy if you're not careful, if you don't get it quite right. If you increase any sort of tax on incomes or jobs or anything like that, you could reduce the amount of work, you can reduce productivity. So they're quite dodgy. But land is different. The land is there. No one can take it away from them. Someone will always want to own that land. If someone wants to sell it because they don't like the tax on it, they'll find a buyer. It doesn't matter that they may have to drop their price. That's of no interest to the government unless there's capital gains involved. And of course, one of the things we very strongly suspect Labour are going to do is raise capital gains in line with income tax as well. So in terms of going back to the general question about, will the budget be a good one or a bad one? It will seem a harsh one. But at the end of the day, what I would say is this, particularly to people on the left, it's going to involve raising taxes on wealthy people, which is basically what we want. Now, we don't want taxes raised on the wealthy just for the hell of fleecing them. It's really a case of so that money is available for more public spending without putting the burden on ordinary people. And even if this budget coming sounds restrictive, it's still, and there'll be a lot of people talking about austerity. Now, we'll wait to see the figures. I strongly suspect it won't be. Austerity, remember, is where you reduce public spending. So if the overall level of public spending in this budget is less, then yes, okay, it's austerity. As someone wrote in The Guardian, austerity under a Labour government is still austerity. Absolutely true. But remember what austerity is when the amount of spending goes down. If the amount of spending goes up, even if there's individual cuts in some areas, if the overall level of spending goes up, then it's not austerity. Or if it even stays the same. The question is, will it? Because on the one hand, you've got taxes being raised and you think, well, if the taxes are being raised to generate more tax revenues, then how can spending go down? Well, it depends how much is assigned to the black hole, really, doesn't it? But it does mean that in future years, and I don't mean like in 10 years' time, I mean even next year's budget and then the year after and so on, if this budget hole is filled in one go, and it doesn't have to be, but if it is, then those taxes still remain in place. If they've raised capital gains tax, that capital gains tax, which remember is only paid by a few percent of the population, like 3% of the population pay capital gains tax, that capital gains tax is still in place for more public spending next year and the year after and so on. If inheritance tax is dealt with, then you've got and you could, again, with inheritance tax, you could even raise the threshold. According to tax experts, you could raise the threshold, which sounds like it's brilliant for people, but still generate more by closing off those bloody loopholes for the super wealthy. But there we go. One angry pagan goes, going back to housing, the housing stock needs to be devalued at least a bit. It does, absolutely. And even Keir Starmer, before the election, said he wanted to see house prices come down. What you don't want is a crash. What you don't want, I'll tell you what you don't want, just politically, if not economically, is a situation where suddenly, because of a tax you've applied, someone's house is worth less than their mortgage. That's what you don't want. So that's why you'd have to start off slow, because you don't want to put someone in a position whereby if they suddenly can't afford their mortgage, they can't sell either. You don't want that sort of trap, that equity trap triggering. So that's why you'd start off with a relatively modest amount of increase for other properties. You'd still make more. You know, you could still, I don't know, but according to this professor, you could still get rid of council tax, replace it with this land tax, this land and property tax, and you could make it cheaper for most people than their council tax currently is. And for those for which it's more expensive, you could do it at initially such a low rate. Because remember, you don't have to go straight for raising 30 billion pounds with this new land tax. You just have to make sure if you're going to get rid of council tax and replace it with this tax, that the overall level of tax, just make sure it's more than is currently coming in for council tax, right? That's all you need to do. Tories already lowered the personal allowance on capital gains from 12,000 a year to 3,000. It's the rate that's the issue. It's the rate what's actually suggested as well. In fact, also the allowance varies according to like the size as well. What's actually suggested is what you need is an upper rate on capital gains tax. That's the problem. Like if you, for example, so let us say you like the Angela Rayner case, for example, which ended up going nowhere. But in theory, because you know she didn't have to pay capital gains tax, but in theory, you might, if you have a second home, let's say you have a holiday home and you bought it some years ago and then you're going to sell it and it's now worth more than you paid for it. So on the extra, you should be, if it's more than, what is it, about £6,000 or something, there's some threshold. But if it's more than a certain amount, I think you've just said 3,000, haven't you? But I thought it was 6,000. But I don't know, I don't pay it. So whatever that threshold is, if it's above it, you have to pay capital gains tax on that, right? Now, where the issue is, for ordinary people, that's about 20% or something, isn't it? It's like, but let's say you are making capital gains of hundreds of thousands a year, you're still paying about 20% on it. Whereas it's like, no, above a certain amount, you should be paying like 40% like income tax. So that's what we're talking about here. It's people who are not just like, they've made a few £1,000s of capital gains. We're talking about the people who are making hundreds of thousands. And at the moment, it's like, it's actually a little bit dubious as to whether they should be declaring it as income or capital gains. It's like, take it away, take away the confusion. Have it be this, you know, you have a separate capital gains to income, but make it the same rate. You could have different thresholds still to make a difference, but ultimately have it at the same rate. So there's no people fiddling stuff by calling something capital gains instead of income, which for something you can do. Bascal there saying more social housing needs to be built. More social housing is being built. I don't know where people are getting this idea that Labour are saying they're not, because actually in Labour's plans there will be more social housing. But what I would also say is this: the problem with council housing, because there's different types of social housing, right? The problem with council houses, if that's what you mean, is what happens is the Tories owe most of their support to that single Thatcher policy of selling council houses and without building any new ones in place. And that's what will happen again. If you build more council houses, you're building more Tory votes for the future, because the Tories will come back in, they'll sell them all off cheap, doing it. They don't care whether it makes good financial sense or economic sense, because we know that they don't give a shit. They will sell them off, buying votes for the future, and those votes will be theirs forevermore. Because I've known some of these people who've bought those council houses when Thatcher was around, and they never would have voted Conservative before, and now they will never vote for anyone else. That's it. Because as far as they're concerned, they got to own their own home, nice, when they wouldn't have been able to buy a home ordinarily. And as far as they're concerned, the Conservatives got their vote for life. That is the problem with council housing. That is why there's an emphasis from Labour, because it's like if letting someone buy their own home is a way to basically buy a vote for life, or for a number of people it is anyway, Labour would rather be the people, they'd rather be the government that did that rather than be the government. You can see it from a political point of view. If you're going to build council houses just so the next Tory government can sell them off and buy votes for life, that's mad. Why would you do that? So until you can stop, and you can't do anything to stop the Tories doing that. No parliament can stop the next parliament doing whatever it wants, as long as it's something that this country can unilaterally do. Vendetta saying housing benefit will need to increase to account for shitty landlords dumping land tax on us. Well, no, they wouldn't. Well, I see what you mean. Sorry, yeah, having to fold that in. But the housing payments, the housing benefits, are just supposed to be reflective of what the average price would be anyway. And I wouldn't say it's shitty of a landlord to pass that on anyway. If it's a tax on the house, they're inevitably going to do that. And yeah, so housing benefit would have to go up a bit. There's only so many people on housing benefit. That wouldn't be a huge cost. You would bring in way more money, because the vast majority of people, because I know what you're thinking. So you're thinking, okay, so if you're unemployed on an unemployment benefit, you don't pay council tax, right? Okay. The vast majority of people do, and I mean the vast majority of people do, hardly anyone has council tax exemption. So the amount of money it would cost to boost up the housing benefit to compensate would be a small part of the extra you would bring in. So that wouldn't be a problem. You would have to think about that, certainly, yes. But there we go. Go for the last few comments because we've run out of time now. Scrap interest-only mortgages. My parents have been trapped in one for years. So I'm not an expert on that. What I would definitely do is scrap buy-to-let mortgages. I know Labour aren't doing that. I think they're going to restrict it a bit, but they're not actually scrapping it, which is disappointing to me. I would 100% scrap buy-to-let mortgages. Like, ordinarily, if we had enough housing stock, I would say it would just effectively be a business loan, do what you want. But given that we haven't, and given specifically that people are struggling to get onto the housing ladder, I would definitely scrap that. However, as I say, the one housing policy that Labour have that I'm really, really positive about is new builds, first-time buyers getting first dibs on new builds, because that will help immensely. Josh saying, not to throw a spanner in your hypothesis, Phil, but what about long-term memory of the population of the Tories? I'm not sure what that is in reference to, though. Sorry. What I know is that it buys votes. Whichever government, if you're someone who's stuck renting, and you're going to be stuck renting your whole life, and that's your perception, you are going to be stuck renting your whole life. The government that lets you own your own home has got your... Not for everyone. Some people will, obviously, there's more nuance there. I mean, Angela Rayner bought her own home. Although I think she did that under Labour. But it's arguably under a Tory scheme, but she didn't become a Tory supporter. She's now the Labour Deputy Prime Minister, but there it is. Buy-to-let mortgages should be at commercial rates. No, get rid of them. Ban them. Just ban them completely. Because all you're doing then, if you're talking about commercial rates, all you're doing is letting... you're just going to increase rents. Because they'll still do it. If they can do it and get away with charging more, they just will do. So no, just ban them. Oh, regarding council housing. But yeah, even so, the people know, like anyone who was able to buy their own home, particularly at a knockdown price, all of a sudden, they're now not renting. These people are not, because they're retired now. They're definitely retired now if they're still alive. They're not renting. They're not paying any rent. They own their own homes outright. And they know that. And that's a saving of hundreds of pounds a month. They know that and that's down to the Tories. So that's why they'll keep voting Tory. So council housing just breeds Tory votes for the future. So it's actually better politically to have a strategy of Labour being the government that lets people buy their own homes. But social housing will be increasing anyway. But that will be ones owned by housing associations and so on. But there we go. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Don't forget to click the like button on your way out, as well as subscribe to the channel, of course. And until next time, I'll see you later.